A Mongol army rides up to your walls and gives you a choice. But the real weapon? The time you take to answer. February 1220. The city of Bukhara wakes up to a nightmare on the horizon. Dust. Miles of it, rising like a storm that shouldn't exist. And through that dust, an army that has crossed deserts, mountains and rivers that were supposed to be impossible to cross. The Mongols are here. You're standing on those walls right now. Your hands are shaking because you've heard the stories. Entire cities, gone, not just defeated, erased. But here's what you don't know yet. What nobody tells you until it's too late. The Mongols don't actually want to fight you. They want you to think. They want you to hesitate. They want you to debate, to discuss, to hold council meetings while the sun sets and rises again. Because every second you wait, you're sealing your fate. How does an army of 100,000 horsemen make millions surrender without fighting? How do they conquer cities in days that should take months to siege? And why do some cities open their gates immediately, while others make a choice they'll regret for exactly 3 days? This is the story of the most brutal psychological weapon ever created, a system so efficient, so terrifying, that it conquered more land in 25 years than Rome did in 400. And it all starts with a simple question: how long will you make us wait? Here's what nobody understands about the Mongols. They didn't conquer the largest land empire in history through superior numbers. They conquered it through superior psychology. One rule that spread faster than their cavalry could ride: surrender immediately or become the lesson, not a threat, a system. And here's the terrifying part: it actually worked because they followed through. Think about it. You're a city governor in 1219. You've got walls, stone walls, 30 feet high. You've got soldiers, thousands of them. You've got supplies for months, maybe a year. A Mongol envoy rides up to your gates, alone, unarmed, and he delivers the message that will define the next century of human history. Submit now, pay tribute, keep your lives, your families, your city. Or, he pauses, looks up at your walls like they're made of paper. Delay, resist, make us work for it. And we'll make sure every city within 500 miles knows what happened here. What do? You've got advisors screaming different answers. The military commander wants to fight. We've never lost these walls. The merchants want to negotiate. Maybe we can buy time. Buy them off. The religious leaders are praying for a miracle. And while you're debating, the Mongols are watching, counting every single how. Because here's the genius of their method. The Mongols turned hesitation into a crime that cities paid for. Not just resistance, hesitation. You see, other armies throughout history would lay siege, wait you out, starve you, eventually break through. Months, years sometimes. The Mongols didn't have months. They were conquering an empire that stretched from Korea to Europe. They needed speed, impossible speed. So they created something that had never existed before, a compliance engine powered by terror. Submit fast, you usually survive. Your city keeps functioning. Sure, you pay taxes, now heavy taxes, but your children live, your wife lives, your city lives. But hesitate? Stall the negotiations? Kill their envoys because you think you're making a statement. Then you don't just lose, you become the advertisement for why the next city shouldn't hesitate. Now here's the problem with threatening cities. Everyone threatens cities. Surrender or die is the oldest line in warfare. So why did people believe the Mongols? Because they built what historians call the credibility engine, and it ran on 3 fuels: demonstration, information, and unpredictability. Let's break it down. Demonstration. The Mongols didn't just talk about what they do, they showed you, and then they made sure everyone heard about it. When a city really resisted, the Mongols would take it eventually. They always did. Impossible walls. They'd divert entire rivers. Unbreakable gates. They'd build siege engines on site, using your own trees, forcing your own captured citizens to push them forward as human shields. But here's the twist. They didn't kill everyone. They'd leave survivors, deliberately, enough people to run, to spread the word, to show up at the next city as refugees with stories that would make your blood freeze. Timothy May, one of the leading historians on Mongol warfare, explains it perfectly. The Mongols used survivors as a psychological weapon. Those refugees weren't mercy, they were propaganda. Think about what happens next. You're in the next city over. You've been debating whether to resist. Then thousands of refugees pour through your gates. They're starving, traumatized, and they all tell the same story. We thought our walls would hold. They held for 6 days. On the 7th day, the Mongols breached. They separated the craftsmen, kept them alive. The soldiers? Every single one. The governor who ordered resistance? They poured molten silver in his eyes and ears. True story, by the way. That actually happened. Now, do you want to resist? Information. The Mongols had something most armies didn't: a sophisticated intelligence network. Spies. Merchants. Informants. They'd send agents ahead of the army. These people would spread rumors, mix threats with promises, whisper about cities that submitted and prospered, scream about cities that resisted and vanished. By the time the actual Mongol army showed up, half the psychological battle was already won. You'd heard the stories for weeks, months, maybe. Each one worse than the last. Each one impossible to verify but too consistent to ignore. I heard they killed 50,000 in Merv in one day. I heard they make pyramids from skulls. I heard they don't even need to breach walls. People open the gates just to make it stop. Some of it was exaggerated. Some of it was true. None of it mattered because the fear was real. Unpredictability. And here's the final piece, the one that made the whole system unbeatable. The Mongols weren't consistent. Sometimes cities that surrendered immediately were spared completely. Taxes, sure, but life continued. Sometimes cities that surrendered immediately were destroyed anyway. Tactical reasons, the Mongols would say. The city of Bolg surrendered without a fight. The Mongols killed them all anyway. Why? Because they wanted the region terrified. Because they needed to prove that even perfect compliance couldn't guarantee safety. That uncertainty, that impossible to predict outcome made everything worse. Because now you couldn't game the system. You couldn't find the safe play. Surrender might save you. Or it might not. Resistance would definitely doom you. But maybe, just maybe, you'd be the one city that held out long enough for help to arrive. Spoiler, help never arrived. The Mongols made sure of that too. Now let me tell you about the city that proved hesitation was fatal. The city that didn't just resist the Mongols, it gave them a reason to invade an entire empire. Otrar, 1218. Remember that name? Because what happened there changed the world. Here's the setup. Genghis Khan is at the height of his power. He's conquered northern China. He's unified the Mongol tribes. But he's looking west now, toward the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the richest, most powerful Muslim empires in the world. And Genghis? He doesn't want war. Not yet. He wants trade. So he does something unprecedented. He sends a caravan, 450 merchants. Muslim merchants, carefully chosen, carrying gold, silver, silk, jade, a fortune that would make kingdoms jealous. This isn't just trade, it's a message. We can be partners. We can make each other rich. Or, the caravan arrives at Otrar. The governor's name is Inalchuk, and Inalchuk makes a decision that will haunt history. He looks at these merchants, these Mongol-sent merchants with their impossible wealth, and he thinks, why should they have this? Why should I let the Mongols grow rich off trade routes through my city? So he seizes the caravan, takes everything, and then, because apparently seizing a fortune wasn't enough, he kills them. All 450, every single one. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's bad, but it's one caravan, one incident. Surely they can negotiate. Genghis Khan sends envoys. 3 of them, 1 Mongol, 2 Muslims. The message is clear: return our property, execute the governor who murdered our merchants, or send him to us for justice. Do this, and we'll forget this happened. A way out, a diplomatic solution, an escape hatch from what's coming. The Shah, the Emperor of Khwarezm, receives these envoys at his palace in Samarkand. He reads the message, and he makes the second worst decision in his empire's history. He kills the Mongol envoy, shaves the beards off the 2 Muslim envoys, a profound insult, and sends them back. His message: I don't negotiate with barbarians. Wrong answer. Genghis Khan receives his humiliated envoys. Here's what happened. And according to the histories, he climbs a mountain alone. prays for 3 days and 3 nights. When he comes down, he's made his decision. The Khwarasmian Empire, an empire of millions, with cities that have stood for thousands of years, has exactly 1 year left to exist. 1219. The Mongol invasion begins, and Otrar, the city where this all started, the Mongols save it for last in the region. Let it watch as every city around it falls. Let the governor see the empire burn because of his decision. When they finally besiege Otrar, it holds for 5 months. 5 months of impossible resistance. The garrison fights like demons because they know what's waiting for them. The walls finally break. The Mongol Purin, they separate the soldiers from the civilians. The soldiers are executed, everyone. The civilians are enslaved or scattered as refugees, living warnings to other cities. And Governor in Alchuk, the man who started this, they find him in the citadel, still fighting. He's throwing bricks down at them, roof tiles, anything he can find, fighting to the literal last moment. The Mongols take him alive, and they execute him by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. The symbolism was clear. You were greedy for silver, now drown in it. But here's what makes this story the perfect case study for the Mongol method. Otrar proved that the threat was real. Every city that heard this story, and they all heard this story, learned the same lesson. The Mongols don't bluff. Diplomatic insult equals invasion. Murder of merchants equals annihilation. It wasn't random cruelty. It was policy enforcement. The Mongols were sending a message to every city, every kingdom, every empire that would ever face them. Test us once, and we'll make sure nobody tests us again. And it worked. After Otrar, after the Khwarasmian cities fell one by one, do you know how many cities resisted the Mongols in the next campaign? Almost none. The Mongol army would appear on the horizon, and gates would open. Sometimes before the Mongols even sent an envoy, city leaders would ride out to surrender, terrified that waiting even 1 extra day might be interpreted as hesitation. Let's talk about why this system was so devastatingly effective, because this wasn't just psychological warfare, it was logistical genius. Here's the problem every conqueror in history has faced. Sieges are expensive. You've got to surround a city, cut off supplies, build siege engines, wait for months, sometimes years, and while you're waiting, you're burning through food, losing soldiers to disease, giving other enemies time to organize against you. The Mongols were trying to conquer the world. They didn't have time for year-long sieges at every city. So they created a system where most cities surrendered without a siege at all. Think about the math. Let's say you're conquering a region with 20 cities. Traditional approach, 20 sieges, 20 long, costly, bloody sieges, years of campaigning, thousands of casualties. Mongol approach, punish 2 or 3 cities so brutally that the other 17 surrender immediately. You've just reduced the cost of conquest by 85%. Every city that resisted and got destroyed made the next 5 cities surrender. Every pile of skulls outside one city meant 5 other cities opened their gates before the Mongols even arrived. Terror wasn't just an outcome, it was a logistics tool. Feversieges. Fewer casualties, faster conquest. One historian described it perfectly. The Mongols didn't need every city to resist, they needed a few cities to resist once. And here's the beautiful, horrible efficiency of it. The system became self-reinforcing. The more cities that heard the stories, the faster they surrendered. The faster they surrendered, the faster the Mongol army could move. The faster the army moved, the more impossible and supernatural they seemed. Cities would hear, the Mongols destroyed Samarkand in 3 days. 3 days. For a city that should have held for months. How is that possible? It's possible because Samarkand's garrison had already heard what happened to Bukhara. Their morale was broken before the first arrow flew. Half the defenders deserted. The other half barely fought. The Mongols had defeated them with information before they defeated them with swords. And the refugees from Samarkand, they fled to the next city, told their story, broke that city's morale too. Rinse and repeat across an entire empire. This is how the Mongols conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome conquered in 400. Not better soldiers, not more soldiers, better psychology. Let's go back to that moment. The moment when the Mongol envoy is standing at your gates. Because understanding this moment, really understanding it, is the key to understanding how the Mongols broke the world. The envoy delivers the ultimatum, and it's brutally simple. 2 options, only 2. Option 1, open your gates now, surrender your city, provide supplies for the army, pay tribute, accept Mongol governance. Your administrators will work under Mongol supervision. Your craftsmen will be identified and potentially relocated. Your soldiers will be absorbed or discharged. But you live, your family lives. Your city continues to exist. Option 2, resist, delay, negotiate, try to buy time for reinforcements that will never come, and face complete annihilation. No third option. No, let's talk about terms. No, give us time to consult with the capital. No, we need to pray about this. Choose, now. This is what historians call negotiations reduced to the essential choice. Surrender or die. But here's what makes it psychological torture. You don't actually know if option 1 is real. Maybe they're lying. Maybe they'll kill you anyway. Maybe surrender just means dying on your knees instead of on your feet. You've heard stories both ways. Cities that surrendered and survived. Cities that surrendered and died anyway. Which story is yours going to be? The Mongol envoy doesn't help you decide. He just waits, stares at you with eyes that have seen 100 cities make this choice. Eyes that tell you he doesn't care which option you pick because he's seen both outcomes 1,000 times. And while you're frozen in that moment of impossible decision, while your advisors are screaming contradictory advice, while the priests are praying and the soldiers are sharpening their swords and the mothers are clutching their children, the Mongols are building siege engines just out of arrow range. They're not waiting for your answer to prepare. They're preparing while you answer, because they know something you don't. Most of the time, the hesitation itself is already the answer. If you were going to surrender, you'd have done it immediately. The moment you start debating, you've already chosen resistance. You just don't know it yet. The Mongols do. Let me take you inside a city that chose option 2, not because they were brave, not because they were stupid, but because they hesitated just a little too long. The city of Merv, 1221. Merv was one of the greatest cities in the world. Some historians think it was the greatest, larger than Baghdad, more beautiful than Damascus. The Queen of the World, they called it. Libraries that held the wisdom of centuries, gardens that defied the desert, walls that had never been breached, a population somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. When the Mongols arrived, Merv's governor faced the choice. He didn't refuse outright. That's the thing. He didn't spit in the envoy's face or kill the messenger. He just deliberated, consulted, bought time, sent messages to the Shah asking for instructions that would never come. He hesitated. 5 days. That's all it was. 5 days of negotiation and discussion, and trying to find a better option than the 2 he'd been given. The Mongols lied siege. And here's where the system reveals its full horror. Once you've hesitated, surrender stops being an option. The governor realized his mistake, tried to surrender on day 7, sent envoys out waving white flags, offering tribute, offering anything. The Mongols sent the envoys back with a message. Too late. The siege engines started firing, not at the walls at the city, at homes, at markets, at crowds. They diverted the irrigation canals. The city's water supply, the thing that made Merv possible in the middle of the desert, started drying up. And they waited. Not months, not years. 13 days. 13 days of bombardment, thirst, and terror. 13 days of watching the impossible happen as the Mongols built ramps up to walls that should have been unscalable. 13 days of seeing your own captured citizens forced to push siege towers forward, human shields making it impossible to fight back without killing your own people. On the 13th day, the walls broke. What happened next became the legend that echoed across continents. The Mongols ordered the population to evacuate the city. Come out peacefully. You'll be sorted and processed. Craftsmen will be spared. Everyone else, we'll see. It sounded like mercy. It wasn't. The people of Merv filed out through the gates, hundreds of thousands of them. They were divided into groups. The craftsmen, the engineers, the metalworkers, the siege experts were separated. They'd be valuable. They'd survive. Everyone else was counted. And then the killing began. It took days. The sources disagree on the exact number because the numbers are so large they become meaningless. Some say 400,000, some say 700,000, some say over 1 million. The Mongol soldiers were each assigned a quota, 200 to 300 people each. They worked in shifts, and when it was done, they built pyramids of skulls, counted them to verify the totals, left them there as monuments. Merv, the queen of the world, became a graveyard so vast that travelers reported decades later you could still smell death from miles away. But here's the crucial thing. The Mongols made sure people survived to tell the story. They kept the craftsmen alive, let some refugees escape during the chaos, made certain that the story of Merv spread to every city within 1,000 miles. And the message was clear. This is what hesitation costs. 5 days. That's all it took. 5 days of debate instead of immediate surrender, and 500,000 people died. Now, let's talk about the other cities. The ones that heard about Merv, about Otrar, about Bukhara and Samarkand and all the others, because this is where the Mongol method proves its genius. The city of Herat, 1221. Right after Merv, the Mongol army appears on the horizon. The governor doesn't call a council meeting, doesn't consult with advisors, doesn't send messages asking for guidance. He opens the gates immediately, rides out personally to surrender, offers supplies, tribute, hostages, whatever the Mongols want. Does it so fast that the Mongol commanders are actually impressed. Herat survives. The population lives. Yes, they pay heavy taxes. Yes, they're under Mongol rule now. But children still play in the streets. Markets still function. Life continues. The cost of hesitation, annihilation. The reward for speed, survival. And city after city learned this lesson. When the Mongols moved into Russia, into Eastern Europe, the pattern repeated. Cities that surrendered immediately like Yaroslavl were spared. Cities that resisted like Ryazan were erased so completely that they had to be rebuilt from nothing centuries later. The word spread faster than the Mongol horses could ride. They're coming! Don't think. Don't debate. Just open the gates. In some regions, cities would send ambassadors OUT to meet the Mongol army days before it arrived. They'd surrender to empty steppe, just to make sure they surrendered fast enough. This is how a Mongol force of 20,000 could control a region of 2 million people. This is how 100,000 horsemen conquered an empire of 30 million. They didn't have to fight most of them, they'd already won. But now, we need to talk about the nightmare scenario, the one that made the entire system even more terrifying, because sometimes, not always, but sometimes surrender didn't save you. Remember Balkh? I mentioned it earlier. Let me tell you that story in full. Balkh was an ancient city, one of the oldest in Central Asia. The mother of cities, they called it. Buddha had supposedly walked its streets. Alexander the Great had conquered it. It had seen empires rise and fall for 2,000 years. When the Mongols arrived in 1220, Balkh's leaders didn't hesitate for a second. They threw open the gates before the Mongol envoy even delivered his message, rode out with tribute, offered everything, did everything right according to the rules they'd learned. The Mongols entered the city peacefully, took the tribute, seemed satisfied, and then they ordered the population to evacuate. The people of Balkh obeyed. What choice did they have? They filed out of the city in orderly columns expecting, relocation, enslavement. Something survivable, surely. They'd surrendered immediately. They'd done everything right. The Mongols killed them all, every single person. Then they destroyed the city, not just conquered it, destroyed it, tore down the walls, burned the buildings, salted the earth. Balkh, the mother of cities, ceased to exist. Why? Tactical reasons, the Mongol commanders said later. They needed the region terrified, needed to prove that even perfect compliance wasn't a guarantee. Needed to show that the Mongols, not the cities, controlled who lived and who died. Think about what this does to the psychology of the next city. You've been telling yourself, if I surrender fast enough, I'll survive. There's a formula. Follow the rules, and you'll make it. Then you hear about Balkh. Now there's no formula, no safe play, no way to guarantee survival. Surrender immediately might save you, or it might not. Resist and you're definitely doomed. But surrender is no longer the obvious choice because it's no longer a guaranteed escape. This uncertainty, this impossible-to-predict outcome made cities even more desperate to prove their loyalty. they'd surrender faster, offer more tribute, provide more supplies. Anything to show they were more cooperative than Bulk had been. Now let's talk about the people the Mongols kept alive, because this is where the method becomes truly diabolical. The Mongols didn't just use survivors to spread fear, they used them as tools. When a city fell, when the walls finally broke, and the Mongol troops poured in, they didn't just kill randomly, they sorted, categorized, selected. Engineers? Alive. You know how to build siege engines. You're coming with us to the next city. Metalworkers? Alive. The army needs weapons, armor, horseshoes. You're valuable. Doctors? Alive. Armies get wounded. You'll serve. Scribes who speak multiple languages? Alive. The Mongols need translators, administrators, record keepers, young, strong men who survive the fighting. You're being conscripted. You'll march with the Mongol army to the next city. And when we besiege it, you'll be in the front lines, fighting your own people, your countrymen, maybe your own relatives if they fled there. Refuse. We kill your family. Then we kill you. Then we find someone else who'll cooperate. This is how the Mongol army grew as it conquered. They'd start a campaign with 100,000 troops. By the end, they'd have 200,000, half of them conscripted survivors from conquered cities. And here's the truly brutal part. They'd use these conscripts as human shields. When the Mongols built siege ramps, who do you think pushed the carts, carried the stones, absorbed the arrows from the defending walls? The people from the last city that resisted. Imagine you're defending your city. You're on the walls with a bow. You see a massive siege tower being pushed toward you. You draw your arrow, aim at the people pushing it, and you recognize them. They're from the city 30 miles away, the city that fell last month. Maybe you have family there. Maybe you traded with them for years. Maybe you knew some of them by name. Do you shoot? If you shoot, you're killing your own people. People who are being forced to attack you on pain of death. If you don't shoot, the siege tower reaches the wall. The Mongols brass. Everyone dies anyway. What do? The Mongols created situations where there was no right answer, no moral high ground, no way to resist without becoming a monster yourself. And the survivors of these sieges, the ones who were conscripted and forced to push the siege towers, they'd survive to be conscripted again and again, forced to attack city after city until they were killed or the campaign ended. If they survived the entire campaign, the Mongols might release them, let them go home. Home to ruins, home to mass graves, home to a city that might not even exist anymore. These survivors became the most effective psychological weapons in the Mongol arsenal, because they didn't just tell stories of what the Mongols did, they told stories of what they themselves had been forced to do. I pushed the siege tower against the walls of my cousin's city. I watched him die. I couldn't stop it. The Mongols made me choose, push the tower or watch my daughter die. What would you have done? No one had an answer for that, and that's what made the terror so complete. It wasn't just fear of the Mongols. It was fear of what you might become if you resisted, fear of what you'd be forced to do, fear of the impossible choices that awaited you. By 1240, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And the hesitation method had become so effective that the Mongols barely needed to use it anymore. The reputation did the work. Cities would surrender to Mongol tax collectors, not armies, tax collectors. Groups of 10 or 20 bureaucrats showing up saying, "The Great Khan requires tribute," and governors of cities with 10,000 soldiers would bow and hand over the money. Why? Because everyone knew, everyone had heard. The stories had spread across 3 continents. Hesitate, and your city becomes the example. But here's what's fascinating. The Mongols started applying this method to everything, not just sieges. Rebellions? Crushed with such overwhelming force that the next province wouldn't dare rebel for generations. Diplomatic insults, answered with invasions that destroyed entire kingdoms. Trade disputes, settled with military expeditions that made it clear, you don't negotiate with the Mongols. You accept their terms, or you cease to exist. The city of Baghdad. 1258. The Abbasid Caliphate had stood for 500 years. Baghdad was the center of Islamic learning, culture, and power. One of the greatest cities on earth. Libraries that held the wisdom of centuries. the house of wisdom where scholars translated and preserved the knowledge of Greece, Rome, Persia, India. When the Mongols sent envoys demanding surrender, the Caliph, the religious and political leader of millions of Muslims, refused. Not defiantly, not with violence. He just refused, politely declined, suggested the Mongols might want to reconsider. After all, he was the Caliph, the successor to the Prophet. Surely the Mongols wouldn't dare. They dared. Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, laid siege to Baghdad. The city held for 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. Then the walls fell. What happened next became one of the darkest moments in human history. The Mongols spent a week systematically destroying everything. The House of Wisdom was burned. Hundreds of thousands of books, irreplaceable manuscripts, the accumulated knowledge of centuries were thrown into the Tigris River. The river ran black with ink for months. The Caliph was captured. And the Mongols, who had a superstition against spilling royal blood, executed him by wrapping him in a carpet and having horses trample him to death. The population, estimates range from 90,000 to 1,000,000 dead. The city, that had been the jewel of Islamic civilization, became a ruin that took centuries to recover from. And the message spread across the Islamic world: your religion doesn't protect you, your history doesn't protect you, your cultural significance doesn't protect you. The only thing that protects you is immediate surrender. So let's ask the question that haunted every governor, every king, every military commander who faced the Mongols. Was there ever a right answer? Could you have resisted successfully? Could you have negotiated? Could you have found the third option that didn't exist? The historical answer is devastating: almost never. Out of hundreds of cities that resisted the Mongols, maybe 5 or 6 survived it. And even those didn't win through superior defense. They survived because the Mongols got distracted by a bigger target. A Khan died, and the army had to return for the succession crisis. The terrain made siege warfare impossible, and the Mongols decided it wasn't worth it. Weather turned so bad, the Mongols withdrew. But pure military victory, defeating the Mongols through superior strategy or courage or willpower, it didn't happen. The city of Xiangyang in China held out for 5 years. 5 years of impossible resistance. The defenders were heroes. They used every trick, every strategy, every weapon they had. The Mongols brought in Muslim engineers from Persia to build new siege weapons, brought in Chinese turncoats to advise them, blockaded the city completely, starved it slowly. After 5 years, Xiangyang fell. The defenders had fought brilliantly. They'd lasted longer than anyone thought possible. They'd become legends. They still lost, because here's the thing about the Mongol method: it didn't matter how brave you were. It didn't matter how strong your walls were. It didn't matter how brilliant your strategy was. The Mongols had time. They had resources. They had an empire stretching across continents feeding them supplies. They had engineers from a dozen conquered nations. They had siege tactics from Chinese, Persian, and European military traditions all combined. And most importantly, they had the knowledge that every day you held out, every Mongol soldier you killed, made your eventual punishment worse. Surrender immediately. Maybe you survive. Resist for a week. Probably everyone dies. Resist for a month. Everyone definitely dies, and it'll be worse. Resist for a year. Everyone dies. Your city is erased, and will hunt down your relatives in other cities and kill them too. The longer you fought, the higher the price. The braver you were, the more complete your destruction. So was there a right answer? Surrender immediately. That was the only play that gave you a chance. But even that wasn't a guarantee. Remember bulk. So maybe the real answer is, there was no right answer. That was the point. The Mongols had created a system where every choice led to horror, where courage and cowardice had the same outcome, where the only variable was how quickly you arrived at your fate. And knowing that resistance was futile and surrender was uncertain broke something in people. It broke the will to resist before the fighting even started. Let me tell you what happened after the Mongols stopped conquering, after Genghis Khan died, after his sons and grandsons finished the campaigns, after the empire stabilized and the massacres ended. The fear didn't stop. Generations later, 50 years, 100 years after the Mongol conquest, the stories were still being told. The fear was still alive. Mothers in Persia would threaten their children, behave, or the Mongols will come back. Poets wrote about the invasions like they were natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, acts of God that couldn't be resisted or understood. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir wrote, "I wish that my mother had never given birth to me, or that I had died and been forgotten before this. I have been too horrified to mention this event. Even now, I find it difficult to write about it." He was writing 30 years after the invasions, 30 years, and he still couldn't process what he'd witnessed. The Mongol method had achieved something unprecedented. It had transformed military conquest into mythology. People didn't talk about the Mongols like they talked about other conquerors. They talked about them like forces of nature, like demons, like the end of the world made flesh. And here's what's terrifying. That was exactly what the Mongols had planned. They hadn't just wanted to conquer territory. They'd wanted to conquer the human imagination, to make the very idea of resistance seem impossible. And it worked. For decades, after the main conquest ended, rebellions in Mongol territory were rare. Not because the Mongols had massive garrisons everywhere they couldn't. The empire was too big. But because people remembered. The stories were still fresh, the ruins were still visible, the mass graves were still there. My grandfather told me about Merv, about how 1 million people died in days. Do you really want to risk that happening again? Do you want to be responsible for that? No one wanted to be responsible for that. So they obeyed, paid their taxes, bowed to Mongol officials, accepted the reality of Mongol rule. The Mongols had built an empire on the corpses of the cities that hesitated, and that foundation was so terrifying, so unshakable, that it held firm for generations. Now here's the part that makes historians uncomfortable, because we want to believe that this kind of brutality was mindless, random, the actions of barbarians who didn't know any better. But that's not what the evidence shows. The Mongol method wasn't random. It was calculated. It was policy. It was, in its own horrifying way, rational. Modern historians have gone back through the sources Mongol, Chinese, Persian, European, and what they found is uncomfortable. The massacres were used judiciously, not at every city, not arbitrarily, but strategically, where they'd have maximum psychological impact, where they'd send the clearest message, where they'd save the most time and resources in the long run. Timothy May, the historian who's done the most comprehensive work on this, describes it as terror used as a tool of governance, not an end in itself, a means to an end. The Mongols would destroy 2 cities to make 10 cities surrender. They'd massacre 100,000 to save the lives of their own soldiers in future campaigns. They'd erase one civilization's capital to make neighboring civilizations submit without bloodshed. Cold, calculated, efficient. And here's the really disturbing part. By their own metrics, it worked. The Mongol Empire at its height controlled more land with fewer troops than any empire before or since. They had 100,000 soldiers controlling 30 million people across 3 continents. How? Because those 30 million people had been taught through the most brutal education system in history that resistance was suicide. The hesitation method had achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. It had made conquest cheap, cheap in Mongol lives, cheap in time, cheap in resources, expensive in everyone else's lives. But the Mongols weren't counting those. So what do we do with this story? What are we supposed to learn from the knowledge that the largest empire in human history was built on a foundation of calculated terror? Here's what keeps me up at night about the Mongol method. It worked because human psychology is predictable. Fear spreads faster than facts. Stories spread faster than truth. And once enough people believe something is inevitable, it becomes inevitable not because it actually was, but because no one tries to resist anymore. The Mongols understood this. They understood that you don't need to defeat every enemy. You just need to defeat enough enemies, publicly enough, brutally enough, that the rest defeat themselves. They understood that hesitation, the natural human instinct to pause, to think, to consider your options, could be weaponized, turned into a trap, made into the crime that justified its own punishment. And here's the thing which should terrify us. That knowledge didn't die with the Mongol Empire. Every authoritarian regime since has studied this playbook. Make the punishment for resistance so severe that resistance becomes unthinkable. Make examples of enough people that everyone else stays in line. Create a climate of fear so pervasive that people police themselves. The methods change. The technology evolves. But the psychology remains the same. The Mongols just did it more efficiently than anyone before or since. They turned hesitation into a crime, turned survival into a lottery, turned entire cities into object lessons, and they built the largest empire in history on the corpses of the people who paused to think. So let's go back to where we started. You're standing on the walls of your city. A Mongol envoy is at the gates. He's delivering the message that will determine whether your children live or die. Surrender now, or become the example. What do? You know what happened to Otrar. You know what happened to Merv. You know what happened to Baghdad. The stories have reached you. The refugees have told you things that made you sick to hear. But you also know what happened to Bolg. You know that surrender doesn't guarantee safety, that sometimes the Mongols kill everyone anyway, that there's no formula that ensures survival. So you're standing there, frozen in the moment of impossible choice, and every second you wait is another second closer to the outcome you're trying to avoid. The Mongol envoy watches you, waits. He's seen this 100 times. He knows how it ends. Do you? The question isn't really about the Mongols anymore. It's about what we do when faced with impossible choices, what we do when every option leads to horror, what we do when hesitation itself becomes the trap. The Mongols conquered the world because they understood one simple truth. Most people, when faced with an impossible choice, will freeze. They'll debate, they'll hope, they'll pray for a third option that doesn't exist. And while they're frozen, the Mongols are building siege engines. The method was simple, the execution was brutal. The results were unprecedented, and the terrible question that the Mongols asked every city they faced still echoes across history. How long will you make us wait? Because every second you hesitate is a second you can't get back. Every moment of indecision is a moment closer to the fate you're trying to avoid. The Mongols knew this. They weaponized it. They built an empire on it. And somewhere, in the ruins of 1,000 cities, in the mass graves of millions, the answer is still waiting. What would you have done? Would you have opened the gates immediately, gambling on mercy from an army that might not offer it? Would you have resisted, knowing you'd lose but refusing to surrender your dignity? Or would you have hesitated just for a moment, just long enough to think and discover too late that the moment of thinking was the moment that sealed your fate? The Mongols don't exist anymore. The empire fell centuries ago. The cities were rebuilt. The mass graves were covered. But the method remains. The psychology remains. The question remains. And if we're honest with ourselves, we still don't have a good answer. Maybe that was always the point. Maybe the Mongols won not just because they were brutal, but because they asked a question that has no good answer. And in that moment of hesitation, that terrible, human moment of trying to find the right choice when no right choice exists, they'd already won.